The Mattel mainstays of sports and gambling return in this episode of Intellivision Archive. We're finally at the end of 1980 and entering the new year in our Intellivision chronology. Two of this video's games, Las Vegas Roulette and PGA Golf, seem to have started reaching stores in late November or December in time for the Christmas holiday, while the other two, tennis and US ski team skiing, are a little more nebulous and likely only made it out in small quantities as early as late November, but more likely late December, before shipping in greater numbers the following year. So it goes, with trying to confirm release dates when stores were printing pretty generic ads. Of all of today's games, Las Vegas Roulette oddly may be the most unique of them for its time. Based on the gambling mainstay where a ball is thrown into a spinning platform and bets are taken based on where it'll land, this is the third entry in Mattel's gambling lineup for the Intellivision, after the pack-in title Las Vegas Poker and Blackjack and Horse Racing, which was also released in time for the Intellivision's national launch in the fall. It's also not one that was really seen as often as Blackjack and Poker were on consoles at the time. Roulette as a video game has only appeared on one other platform sold in the US by this point, APF's incredibly obscure MP1000, a console estimated by engineer Ed Smith to have sold a whopping 100,000 units during its entire lifespan. The game allows one or two players to set the amount of money they want to bring to the roulette table, between $0 and $9,999, though the manual advises against maxing out, as then you simply won't win anything above that point. You then have 3 chips that you can place around the board depending on how you want to wager. As expected, the more unlikely you are to succeed, the bigger the payout is if you do, with the odds listed in the game manual. Once a chip is placed where you want it, you can then use the keypad to enter the size of your wager on that chip up to $99. Once all 3 of your chips are placed where you want them, you press either of the lower side buttons to get the wheel spinning. A cute little animation plays of the roulette numbers spinning along the top with the ball bouncing around until it finally slots in on one of them. You'll then get an indication if any of your bets paid off, and then have the opportunity to adjust your wagers. As far as I can tell, all the potential betting options here align with what you'd find in a casino. You can bet on specific numbers, on red or blue, odds or evens, the higher or lower ends of the number scale by the dozens, or by specific groupings of numbers in several different permutations. At any point, you can press the upper side button to view your total remaining pool of money. If you like roulette, there is a lot to appreciate here. This game was written by APH staffer Walter Bright prior to leaving the company in June 1979. Bright graciously gave me some time to answer a few questions about roulette's development. Walter Bright got his start coding games out of the 101 Basic Computer Games book while going to school at Caltech. Around 1977, he took a part-time job at APH to earn some extra money, doing wire wrap assemblies of circuit boards before moving on to writing the 6800 assembler code for a handheld hockey game for Mattel. As with many other APH games for Intellivision, Bright said he was assigned roulette given art assets from Mattel and just entered the hex codes for it from there. The Intellivision's unusual design with specialized graphics hardware was the only way to get a suitable performance out of the slow microprocessor used in the console, he remarked. Another person, John Brooks, is credited by the Intellivision Lives game package on roulette as well, and probably is the person who actually finished it up. Bright remarked that as far as he knew, roulette was complete when he left APH, but evidently Mattel must have wanted some additional changes that led to someone else modifying the program later. The APF take was not particularly visual appealing compared to what APH did on an admittedly more powerful hardware, though it certainly plays the part well. Unlike Las Vegas Roulette, the MP1000 version included slots and Keno on the same cartridge, yet this shortcoming for the Mattel game appears to have been the result of cartridge size limitations. Based on a list of games provided with a play cable unit sold from a store in New Jersey, there was a game called Vegas 2 in development that seemingly became Las Vegas Roulette. Atari Age user Deckel managed to find a prototype of Vegas 2 on a Technology Associates PDP-11 data cassette. And here, roulette was paired with Slots, a slot machine program, albeit a version missing a cherry in the third reel due to the hardware limiting sprites to 8 on screen at a time. Evidently, this was never sorted out due to the game size. Intellivision cartridges in 1980 maxed out at 4 kilobytes. with the released version of Roulette landing at about 3.2K. Vegas 2, in contrast, is about 3.9K with its in-development graphics and play elements. The wheel spins constantly here, the animations are harder to parse, and betting is more complicated and tedious, though the keypad is repurposed to shortcut to specific kinds of bets. It's likely that this was the game as Bright had developed it, or at least an in-progress beta while he was working on it. The anonymous but seemingly knowledgeable Walter Ives on Atari Age commented that Roulette's Vegas 2 version had placeholder betting elements and the wheel graphics that had to be reworked at the cost of cartridge space, while slots still needed an arm and that ninth graphical element, adding that ultimately one of the games had to be cut for space, and it ended up being slots. Slots did end up being used for TV POW, a television game show where players would call in and yell POW into a phone line to activate a button press. It appears in much better shape in the surviving video clips online. Bright remembered nothing about slots, so this may have been a project of Brooks's. Las Vegas Roulette could certainly not be called popular by any stretch. Internal Mattel's sales numbers through mid-1983 suggest that by June of that year, it had only shipped 106,300 copies, averaging around 30,000 new copies hitting store shelves each year. Gambling video games are a bit of a hard sell since you miss out on the actual financial side of gambling. And even though Roulette is a pretty good implementation of the game, you're just not going to get that much out of it compared to something like blackjack or poker that relies more on strategy. Perhaps owing to largely going overlooked, there's very little magazine coverage of the game at the time. The game gets mentioned in a roundup of casino games and electronic games, with it being the sole discussed console version of Roulette. It did get reviewed in the 1984 Software Encyclopedia, where it largely received good marks, an overall rating of 6 out of 10, with the caveat that it wasn't ideal for solitary play. Intriguingly, buried in a Wayback Machine version of the Blue Sky Rangers website, there is an indication that another gambling game, Las Vegas Craps, was also developed by APH and apparently completed and paid for, but never actually published or even advertised. Walter Ives suggested that this was Vegas 1, and the 1979 CES demo video indicates that at one point Mattel thought they could cram it, roulette, and slots onto one cartridge. Las Vegas Craps was likely cancelled due to extremely poor sales of Las Vegas Roulette, leaving that particular game of chance missing in action from home consoles for years to come. After his time at APH, Bright went on to line up an impressive array of achievements, creating the D programming language, right in the computer game Empire Wargame of the Century, developing multiple compilers, and producing an array of articles and keynote addresses regarding computer coding. He told me that while the money at APH wasn't great, the hours were flexible, and getting to work with David Rolfe, Shel Farley, Will McCowan, Glenn Hightower, and Hal Finney was the real benefit, working with the best in the industry and learning all their tricks and techniques. Our next game, PGA Golf, may seem a little familiar to longtime viewers of this channel for its mention in the Atari Archive Golf episode. There, I called it a big step forward in the evolution of golfing video games, which is an assessment I still stand by. Compared to the earlier computer versions of the sport, or even the Odyssey 2 and Atari VCS versions, PGA Golf is dramatically more complex and realistic, as well as more visually appealing. Written by Scott Bishop at APH, players face 9 holes on the PGA golf course, with the usual array of obstacles: sand traps, water hazards, rough terrain, trees, and the green itself. Your goal is to get your ball in the hole in the fewest shots possible, much as in the actual sport. Unlike Atari's game or the Odyssey 2 one that it ripped off wholesale, players get to use the keypad to choose which golf club they want to use for each shot, each of which has its own use depending on the terrain and the distance you're after. The Intellivision disc is used to set your shot angle in one of its 16 directions, while the action buttons on the side of the controller provide your shot power and angle. Which button you press determines if it's going to be a long, medium, or short-range shot, while pressing it again during the swing animation determines the angle of the shot. If you can hit that second press while the club is at its lowest point in its animation, you'll go straight. Too early will hook it left, and too late slices it right, with no second button press causing a random angle to be selected. You can't put any spin on the ball, but given the sheer amount of options for a 1980 golf game, coupled with the clever take on the actual swing, which predates the meter-based approach standardized by Nintendo's Famicom golf game by years, it's hard to consider this anything but a masterwork for its time. The game even simulates the effectiveness of certain clubs for specific situations. For example, some of the irons tend to pop the ball up higher upon connecting with it, and getting around trees requires using the right club to avoid the branches. The manual has a few handy charts showing how each club causes the ball to travel and how far. Naturally, something like the sand wedge is ideal for getting out of sand traps, while irons are more useful in the rough than the woods. If you hit the ball into the water, you can either choose to play it at the shoreline or have it reset back at the starting point, albeit with the player no longer getting to use their driver for that initial shot. Unlike most other Intellivision sports games, there's no difficulty options. PGA Golf takes all of its challenge from the core game itself. If it fumbles anywhere, it's the putting. The tiny size of the hole makes it very difficult to line up your shot correctly and get the ball in. But even this isn't that big a deal, considering just how much this game gets right, with very little to look at for guidance. It also suffers from a lack of randomization, as while tree locations shuffle around, the courses themselves remain the same. But this is true of other contemporary golfing games, so it isn't that big a ding against PGA Golf. PGA Golf would end up becoming one of Mattel's centerpiece advertising items in 1981 as part of the company's advertising campaign, comparing Intellivision sports titles to Atari VCS ones. And compared to Major League Baseball or NFL football, arguably PGA Golf is the most dramatic of all of these. You could make the claim that Atari's own home run and football cartridges were aiming for a more stripped-down, arcade-centric approach to the sports, but PGA Golf really does do pretty much everything better than Atari's VCS Golf cartridge, which again, author Michael Lorenzen has said was requested by one of his bosses to be an unauthorized clone of Magnavox's Computer Golf for the Odyssey 2. The Intellivision is more powerful hardware, sure, but the ambition seen here makes this unquestionably the best golf cartridge in its day, and one that is still pretty fun to play today. That said, PGA Golf appears to be more on the niche side of Mattel's sports library. According to a mid-1983 internal memo, PGA Golf sold to retailers approximately 33,000 copies in its brief 1980 retail run, before selling 150 and 157,000 in 1981 and 82, respectively. By mid-83, the game had sold to stores 364,100 units, a far cry from the sizable numbers baseball, football, and basketball polled, but more than hockey, soccer, and our next game, tennis. Golf has always been a bit more of a niche sport than some of these others, so those sales are certainly nothing to sneeze at. At the least, it was well reviewed in its day. In video, Bill Kunkel and Arnie Katz appreciated its focus on club selection and usage over putting, the implementation of terrain, and the novel approach to your swings, remarking that its novel features make it a game that will likely see frequent play. Electronic Games ran a roundup of video sports titles in July 1982, where PGA Golf was praised once again as the most complex golf game on the market, and one that should appeal to real-world golfing enthusiasts. The June 1983 edition of Video Games also had a sports game roundup that prominently featured PGA Golf, where the author noted that while they had no interest in actual golf, they found this home version thoroughly enjoyable and addicting, once again praising the club selection and swinging mechanics. British Columbia paper The Times Colonist singled out PGA Golf in its October 1981 article about video games, picking out the randomization elements of the hole layouts and club selections in particular. And the 1984 Software Encyclopedia saw high marks for PGA Golf in graphics and sound, while dinging it for not zooming in on the green for the putting phase. PGA Golf was eventually superseded by Chip Shot Super Pro Golf in 1987, written by Steve Ettinger, Connie Goldman, and David Warhol for INTV. Unlike some of those other refreshed sports titles, Chip Shot was written from the ground up with no reused code, and has a truly impressive array of features, multiple courses, including the option to design your own, the then-modern swing meter, wind and putting green slopes, and putting a left or right spin on the ball. While I couldn't say how well Chip Shot sold, it's worth pointing out that Computer Entertainer, likely the only newsletter reviewing games in 1987, gave it 4 stars in play and graphics, a higher score than they provided to The Legend of Zelda in the same issue. As I said at the beginning, it's hard to tell exactly when these next 2 games reached stores. Some of the more generic advertising running in November suggests that these were available at that time, but the Blue Sky Rangers website points to them both shipping in January 1981. The internal sales memo suggests only a few thousand copies went out to stores in 1980, suggesting that it's much more likely that a paltry number shipped in December, likely near the end of the month, with a much broader release in January. For that reason, we'll consider them December releases for the sake of this video series, letting them wrap up this eventful first year in the Intellivision's life. And we'll start off with Tennis, an interesting effort that unusually is overshadowed by Activision's take on the game on the VCS, which came out only a few short months after this one. Tennis was written by Gavin Claypool as his sole credited work. Presumably Claypool was another summer hire at APH, but I can't say for sure. This is a one-on-one take on the sport that manages to do quite a bit right, but also comes off as deeply odd, contrasted against the more influential Activision title. Like most of these early Intellivision sports games, Tennis is a solely two-player game with no computer opponent, and it's one that provides you with an ample array of options to get the ball past your opponent. The keypad takes a minor role here, being used to help decide the game speed at the start of the game, with the disc, also per usual, selecting the highest speed, and to determine where you'll aim your serves. The side buttons provide the action beyond that. The top buttons are used for hard, low swings, while the lower buttons launch slower, higher lobs. The disc maneuvers your player around the court, and unlike Activision's game, it's not enough to just stand near the ball to hit it. You need to actively press a button at the right time to either serve or return it. The game unsurprisingly follows the rules of tennis pretty closely, with players required to win 3 sets out of 5 to win a match. Every odd number game, the players automatically switch sides of the court. The perspective being horizontal is something that you can adjust for if you're not used to it, but the fussiness over hitting the ball takes a lot more work. The manual indicates you can only hit the ball if it's between the player's head and knees, and within a racket's reach to the right or left. The ball does cast a shadow, making this one of the earliest sports games to do so, along with Activision's Tennis, and this also makes it easier to align yourself with the ball on the y-axis. But this being an Intellivision game, it's not just a matter of being in the right place and hitting which button you want, as you will also need to put angle on the ball depending on where your racket makes contact with the ball. An early swing angles the ball towards the top of the screen, a midpoint swing sends it straight forward, and a late swing sends it towards the bottom. This is at once a welcome bit of complexity, and also yet another not exactly intuitive aspect to keep track of when playing the game. I can't complain too much about the actual play of the tennis rallies in this cartridge though, as they're pretty fun and well paced. Serving is another story, however, as it requires really good timing for a hard shot to not go too far or too low. And still decent timing for the lob shot, and returning it can bring its own difficulties. Weirdly difficult to really get the game rolling, even if it's pretty good once it does. There are some cute graphical touches, such as the crowd actively watching where the ball goes, though you may not notice that while you're playing. I don't necessarily want to keep bringing this back to Activision's Tennis, but there is a reason why that one seems to be better remembered, on top of being on a more popular platform. Alan Miller made a very arcade-friendly version of the sport, where positioning resolves your targeting problems, and serves rarely hit the net in fault. Video games seem to have eventually embraced the additional options seen here in the Intellivision Tennis title, but a multiplayer-only and kind of fussy early Intellivision game is not the easiest sell. Evidently this was literally true of Tennis as well, which sold to retailers a respectable but not amazing 337,700 units by mid-1983, including a whole 9,500 in these waning days of 1980. While Activision's Tennis won an Archie Award, Mattel's game was still well received. The 1984 Software Encyclopedia gave it high marks for graphics, sound, and versus play, indicating that it would be hard to find a more detailed tennis game on the market, but that its complexity makes it a bit too difficult to master. Electronic Games noted that Tennis emphasizes shot placement and selection in a way that Activision's game does not. Video Games' own Sports Roundup dubbed it even more realistic a simulator than Activision's Tennis, one that is difficult to master because nothing is taken for granted. Despite that, they add, the game is so good that it's well worth learning the ins and outs of it. Mattel did plan on releasing a follow-up to this game for their ECS module that would have allowed for 4 players using a vertical perspective, but once Mattel Electronics was shuttered, the rights went to Mattel's French office successor, Nice Ideas, who retooled it into a standard Intellivision game, published by Dextel in 1984 in Europe and by INTV in 1985. Championship Tennis has a computer opponent and a new angle, but the same problems with successfully serving pop up. This is a game that seems to demand a certain degree of practice to really appreciate, making it a harder sell than most of the other late-era Intellivision sports titles. But as for the original Intellivision Tennis, it's pretty unique for its time, and a decent enough game if you like the sport. Just don't expect it to hold your hand like Activision's game will. Our final title for this video is US Ski Team Skiing, a truly ridiculous title and licensing venture on Mattel's part, but a pretty respectable sports game. Written by APH's Scott Reynolds, the game has players skiing down one of two courses, one for a slalom game mode where players must wind their way through a series of fairly closely placed gates, and the downhill mode, where you have to speed down a shorter hill to pass through far apart gates. You also get to decide how steep you want the slope to be, from a fairly gentle 1 to an extremely steep 15, as well as how fast you want the game to go between 4 game speeds. Skiing also allows up to 6 players at a time, with players, unsurprisingly, sharing the controllers. Your skier gets 3 attempts or heats at the course, with the fastest time shown on screen through subsequent runs. At the conclusion of 3 heats, the fastest skier is the winner. Just as in the actual sport, of course, you can't just skip gates, as doing so adds 5 seconds to the time as a penalty. But sometimes that may be preferable if you're wildly out of position and would lose more time trying to get over to it. Downhill courses also feature moguls, clumps of snow that either need to be avoided or jumped using the lower side buttons. Though mistiming your jump will cause your skier to hit the mogul and fall. The upper side button, meanwhile, allows you to make sharper turns than you normally could for obstacle avoidance or simply hitting gates. The controls take a little work to get used to, nothing out of the ordinary for an Intellivision sports game at this point, but they work pretty well and result in a fun little skiing game. Much like tennis, however, US Ski Team Skiing is probably overshadowed by Activision's work on the Atari VCS. Bob Whitehead's own skiing cartridge came out the exact same December as this, which also features slalom and downhill modes, as well as a randomized course option, something sorely missing here. That said, they're both very good, and Intellivision owners certainly didn't have much reason to feel envious over their skiing cartridge. Both games were predated by Magnavox's Alpine Skiing for the Odyssey 2, but they both also very much build upon what it accomplished, even if there's no sign that either was directly inspired by it. Video Games praised this one in its sports roundup, putting it on par with Activision's skiing with some added features such as the steepness rating and the tight turn button, missing from that VCS title. They praised the graphics and sound and noted that the Intellivision controller doesn't really work against the game, outside of taking a little getting used to. In video, skiing wasn't considered anything particularly new compared to existing skiing titles, but nevertheless they found it packed a great deal of details into a pretty easy-to-learn game. The 1984 software encyclopedia once more gives US Ski Team Skiing a good review, indicating that memorizing the course layout is crucial to getting a good time. And Electronic Games gave Mattel's skiing program feature time in its strategy session portion, explaining how to handle gates in the most efficient way possible. As noted earlier, US Ski Team Skiing really came out at the very end of the year, and its initial 2,600 unit sales for December really reflect this. But it very quickly made up the gap, selling 192,600 units in 1981, another 228,400 copies in 1982, and a few thousand in 1983, to wrap its internally recorded run at about 427,500 copies shipped and sold to retailers. This makes it one of the more solid-selling games in the library, and evidently it was one of the more respected too, reviewing very well. US Ski Team Skiing did very much serve as the basis for Mountain Madness Super Pro Skiing, a late-era IMTV release for the Intellivision. Created by Ray Kastner, Connie Goldman, and David Warhol using the older game's code base, Mountain Madness adds in 32 built-in courses and the option to either design your own or have the computer automatically generate one for you, with various new obstacles to deal with. If Mountain Madness is available, it's hard to really recommend playing the older skiing title, but even without the enhancements, this is a pretty solid experience, and one of the stronger Intellivision sports titles in the ever-growing lineup. And with this, we reach the end of 1980 for the Intellivision. The system has seen its full national launch at this point, and Mattel's staff have hit upon a pretty successful ad campaign directly attacking market leader Atari. Thanks to this, the company managed to sell its entire inventory of 176,000 systems for the holiday season, and that puts the Intellivision on pretty strong footing going into its first full year as a national competitor. The pace of new releases slows down significantly in 1981, as in 1980 Mattel started hiring in-house developers known today as the Blue Sky Rangers to take over the bulk of game production, though by no means does this mean APH has been cut out entirely. We'll continue to see some titles from that development house into 1983. That said, while the number of new games for 1981 is pretty small, the system also sees some of its more iconic upcoming works that year, so those who have picked up Mattel's higher-end console certainly have some fine titles to look forward to. Next time, we're skipping ahead to November 1981 to crush some rocks.